Blake and the bodyguard both gasped at the same time. How is this possible? Keith, this... Blake was so scared that his voice trembled and he stuttered badly. But his bodyguard was well trained. Titan's expression went from stunned to normal in a single moment. Then, he began moving toward Keith again. He kicked out at Keith's head. Hammer fist proficiency activated. Keith was fast enough to avoid the attack, and he turned gracefully and landed a kick to the bodyguard's knees. But Titan was more stable than he'd expected. The huge bodyguard gave the tiniest wobble, but the full-force kick wasn't nearly enough to topple him. Clearly, Keith was still not strong enough. However, he still had his hammer fist proficiency, and he put it to use by quickly yanking the bodyguard's feet out from under him. This time, his strategy was good enough, and Titan finally lost his balance and crashed to the ground. Keith used his advantage to attack. He kicked the bodyguard's head, and Titan blacked out on the spot. Within 3 attacks, he'd been able to defeat this man too. It was sheer luck that he'd still had the stones to throw at them earlier on, but this time around, it was all him. He was a real fighter, and this was his very own victory. Blake's face was as blank and pale as a sheet of paper. He was no longer the arrogant jerk he'd been just minutes earlier. Now, he was eyeing Keith in terror. Christina was scared too. She never expected her ex-boyfriend to be so powerful. By this time, the show had attracted a crowd of passersby. They looked on with wide eyes and began to murmur to each other. "Whoa, this kid's powerful. Is he a Marine? A martial arts expert? If I had a man like that, I'd never be scared again." The crowd swelled until the garden was flooded with the sound of excited chatter. Keith didn't care about any of these things. He stepped boldly towards Blake. It seemed like he really was going to break his legs. Blake was in a state of complete fear and horror. His entire body trembled to the point where tears fell from his eyes. He stared at Keith and shook his head as he pleaded, "No, don't come any closer." But Keith was no longer in his right mind. His anger had taken over his rationality, and he didn't care about anything but revenge. He walked towards the trembling man and looked down at him. Slowly, he crouched down and raised his fist. "This is my revenge. I'm going to crush you." But before he could do anything else, Christina rushed over. She grabbed Keith's raised hand and pleaded in a shaky voice, "Keith, don't be so impulsive, please." Keith looked at her and suddenly came back to himself. If he hurt Blake any further, he could be convicted of deliberately harming him, and even if that didn't happen, he could still incur the wrath of the Carrington group, and that was a sure way to put a target on his own back. After all, he had no power or influence. He hardly even had any money. There was no way he could win against someone like Blake, who had such a strong background. He looked at Christina, and his expression softened. He said indifferently, "You're right." "Oh, thank God." But before Christina could actually breathe a sigh of relief, she heard the second half of Keith's sentence, and it shook her to her core. "But I'm Keith Sanderberg, and I'm utterly ruthless." With that, he punched Blake mercilessly in the face. Crack! The crowd heard the sound of Blake's nose breaking, followed by his ear-splitting scream. The garden fell silent. Some of the spectators had wanted to intervene and break up the fight, but now they cowered back instead. They didn't want their bones broken too. This young man really was as ruthless as he'd said. You crushed Blake's desire to mock you. Attribute point +1. You crush the bodyguard's desire to teach you a lesson. Attribute point +1. You crushed Blake's desire to not have his nose broken. Attribute point +1. You've satisfied the interest of the people around you watching the show. Wish value +1. You've neutralized the desire of the people around you to persuade you to stop fighting. Attribute point +1. Total free attribute points 4. Total wish value 3 of 10. The system notifications continued ringing in Keith's mind as Blake wailed helplessly on the ground. Keith looked down at him with disdain and sneered. "Who's finished now, huh?" But Blake didn't answer. Other than the sound of him groaning in pain, the scene was deathly silent. Keith turned to look at Christina, whose face had drained of all color. He snorted and turned to leave, but suddenly, a woman in a police uniform emerged from the crowd. The newcomer looked to be in her mid-20s. She had an elegant, dignified appearance, and her face was calm. Even in her police uniform, she was breathtakingly beautiful. She walked over slowly, and her eyes traveled to the man on the ground. She frowned and looked back up at Keith. "Keith, what's going on here?" She was the sergeant in the team Keith worked in, and thus his immediate superior. Her name was Quinn Taylor. She was famous for being one of the best and strictest officers on the force. She held her team to the highest standards, and herself even more so. Keith was stunned for a moment when he saw her, but he quickly regained his composure and dropped his cold demeanor. He chuckled lightly as he said to her, "Sergeant Taylor, what are you doing here? I was just dealing with the dispute." "Dispute?" Quinn frowned and furrowed her eyebrows slightly. She'd only just arrived at the scene and had no idea what had happened. Blake, still lying helplessly on the ground, looked at Quinn with a ray of hope and shouted, "Officer, I'm Blake Carrington. This man broke my nose and was about to kill me. Arrest him." "Huh?" Quinn turned to Keith and whispered, "What the hell's going on here?" Keith exhaled heavily. It's kind of difficult to explain, Sergeant. We should probably get him to a doctor first." Quinn nodded and looked over to the edge of the crowd. The hospital security had already arrived with a number of EMTs. "Over here," Quinn called out to them. "Looks like we got a broken nose." Hearing the officer's orders, the EMTs hurried over. As they loaded Blake onto a stretcher, he wailed at Quinn, "My father's taxes pay your wages, officer. You better have an explanation for this." Quinn gave Blake a sharp look and said, "Mr. Carrington, it's the duty of every citizen to pay taxes. My department is here to serve the people, not your father's company. Why should I owe you any kind of explanation? Furthermore," she went on, "right now I'm off duty, so if you want to take this any further, you'll need to call the station." There was a cold righteousness in her words that left no room for judgment. Blake was utterly humiliated, and his expression turned resentful. He glared at Quinn in anger before turning back to Keith. "Just you wait, Sanderberg," he hollered. "I'll sue you till you're bankrupt and have you sent down for life." Keith smirked quietly as he said, "Summer really is full of so many noisy bugs. So annoying. Next time a mosquito dares to buzz in my ear, I'll have no choice but to silence it for good." Keith's voice slowly became cold again, and his eyes bore sharply into Blake. Blake's broken nose throbbed unbearably, and he shuddered. He was overwhelmed with emotions, pain, fear, and humiliation, until he became so angry that he fainted. Christina wiped the tears from her eyes and looked at Keith. Then she hurried away after Blake. The show was finally over. Most of the crowd was afraid of Keith, and they glanced at him one last time before going their separate ways. Quinn looked at him in concern and asked, "Keith, is your head all right?" Keith laughed and replied with a smile, "Thank you for your concern, Sergeant. I'm fine." "Okay, well, that's good to hear. Come on, let's take a walk." The moon was shining brightly in the sky as Quinn walked with Keith through the hospital garden. She frowned at him and asked, "What happened just now? You broke Blake Carrington's nose?"